The slap from my father Marshall was so powerful that it left my head spinning and my vision blurred for a moment, but the stinging physical pain on my cheek didn't hurt nearly as much as the cold, hard truth I had been holding in my hands since 2 days ago. My name is Tessa. I am a 29-year-old financial consultant living in Columbus, and I recently realized that my entire life has been a carefully constructed lie maintained by the people I trusted most in this world. My younger brother Beckett stood behind our father with a rehearsed expression of desperation while demanding another $10,000 after claiming he had already exhausted his entire tuition fund in just 2 weeks. When I looked him in the eye and firmly said, "No," the man who raised me lost all control, lunging forward to strike me while screaming about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. I didn't flinch or cry because I looked directly into Marshall's eyes and whispered the words that instantly drained the color from his face. "I know everything about the accounts, the fake admission letters, and where that money actually went." The sudden shift from his violent aggression to absolute trembling terror was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed, especially as he realized his role as the mastermind was officially over. I have already contacted my lawyer, Douglas, and the next step of my plan is going to dismantle their lives piece by piece until nothing remains. Before I reveal how I trap them in their own web of deceit, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me which city you are watching from, so I can thank you personally in the next video. Everything started 6 months ago when Marshall used the pretext of family ties to pressure me into selling the investment apartment I had worked so hard to acquire in downtown Columbus. My father had organized a formal family meeting in our living room, creating an atmosphere of urgent crisis while presenting a series of fabricated admission letters from New York University. He spoke with a trembling voice about how my younger brother Beckett had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change our family legacy through a prestigious master's degree in economics. Marshall looked me straight in the eye, claiming that as the successful older sister, it was my moral obligation to ensure my brother didn't lose his future due to a temporary lack of funding. I remember the heavy silence in the room as Marshall detailed the supposed tuition costs, which totaled nearly $500,000 for the entire program, including living expenses in Manhattan. Trusting my father's judgment and wanting the best for my brother, I eventually succumbed to the relentless emotional blackmail and agreed to liquidate my only significant asset. My best friend Beverly was the only person who dared to voice any suspicion during those early weeks of the process. While we were sitting in a quiet corner of our favorite local cafe, Beverly warned me that Marshall had always exercised excessive control over Beckett's finances and every significant decision. She pointed out that it seemed strange for a 19-year-old to have zero direct communication with the university's financial aid office himself. "Tessa, you are handing over your entire future based on documents that Marshall is gatekeeping," Beverly said while looking at me with genuine concern. Despite her warnings, I chose to believe that my father wouldn't deceive his own daughter for the sake of a gambling debt or personal greed. The weeks following the sale were filled with an intense pressure that Marshall labeled as big sister responsibility, effectively silencing any questions I tried to ask. My father became the sole intermediary for all transactions, insisting that large sums of money be transferred directly to a private account he managed for Beckett's education. He would often praise my brother's supposed brilliant future while subtly reminding me that my career success was meaningless if I didn't support my male heir. I began to feel like a mere bank account rather than a member of the family, especially when Beckett started avoiding my questions about his course schedule or campus housing. The first real crack in the facade appeared when I noticed that the tuition payments didn't align with the official NYU academic calendar. I spent several nights reviewing the bank transfers, noticing that the money was being moved in irregular increments that seemed more consistent with personal withdrawals than institutional fees. Whenever I tried to bring this up during dinner, Marshall would immediately turn aggressive, accusing me of being petty and bean counting my brother's success. He would say, "Your brother is under enough stress without you hovering over every cent like a suspicious stranger." This defensive reaction only fueled the growing intuition that my father was the true architect behind Beckett's sudden academic ambitions. I started realizing that Beckett's role was likely just a front, a convenient excuse that Marshall used to guilt-trip me into emptying my savings. One evening, I overheard Marshall talking on the phone in his study, his tone hushed, but filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He wasn't talking about textbooks or dorm supplies. He was discussing interest rates and offshore wire transfers with someone whose voice sounded nothing like a university official. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribs, as the realization began to sink in that the tuition fund was disappearing into a void controlled entirely by my father. The image of the golden sun was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion designed to keep me compliant and working. I didn't confront them right then, choosing instead to begin my own silent investigation into where those hundreds of thousands of dollars were actually going. At 6 o'clock in the evening, exactly 2 days before the physical assault occurred, I was sitting in the office of my lawyer, Douglas, with a stack of crumpled documents spread across the mahogany desk. My lawyer Douglas had spent the last hour meticulously comparing the admission letters I provided with the official database of New York University, while his expression grew increasingly grim. He eventually turned the computer screen toward me, revealing that the letterheads and the signatures of the dean were nothing more than a crude product of digital manipulation and clever cutting. Every piece of paper that Marshall had used to justify the sale of my apartment was a complete forgery designed to mimic an institutional reality that never existed for my brother. Douglas leaned back in his leather chair while sighing deeply, explaining that the school had no record of Beckett ever applying for any graduate program in their economics department. The most devastating blow came when Douglas began tracing the movement of the $480,000 that I had transferred into what I thought was a secure education fund. He pointed to a series of offshore bank statements showing that Marshall had secretly diverted every single cent into a private account under his own name within 48 hours of each transfer. There was a clear and consistent pattern of these funds being immediately funneled into high-stakes gambling websites and luxury debt repayments that had nothing to do with textbooks or housing. Every single dollar you sent away flowed directly back into your father's pockets. Tessa, Douglas said, with a tone of heavy disappointment that echoed through the quiet office. I gripped the edges of the desk until my knuckles turned white, realizing that my family had viewed my hard-earned success as nothing more than a resource to be harvested for their own vices. It appears they are not just lying about the money, they are actively trying to bleed me dry until I have nothing left, I replied while struggling to keep my voice from trembling with rage. The realization of Marshall's true role as a mastermind became undeniable when Douglas showed me the mounting pile of legal notices regarding our family's ancestral property. My father was drowning in massive gambling debts and had been using Beckett as a strategic shield to guilt-trip me into providing a constant stream of emergency cash. Beckett wasn't just a spoiled younger brother spending money on clothes. He was a willing accomplice performing a scripted role under Marshall's direct orders to ensure I remained compliant. I recalled several instances where Beckett had come to me with tears in his eyes, begging for tuition top-ups, while Marshall stood in the background looking like a heartbroken parent who just wanted his son to succeed. It was all a carefully choreographed performance, a theatrical production, where my empathy was the primary target of their greed. Despite the overwhelming urge to drive home and scream at them for their betrayal, I knew that a premature confrontation would only give them time to hide the remaining assets. Douglas advised me to remain absolutely silent for the next 48 hours while he finalized the paperwork to freeze the remaining accounts and protect my mother's trust fund. This trust was the last thing my mother had left for me, and I could see from the recent bank activity that Marshall was already preparing to forge my signature to access it. I had to go back to that house in Columbus and pretend that I was still the naive, supportive daughter they thought they could easily manipulate. I spent that evening watching them across the dinner table, observing how Beckett practiced his struggling student persona, while Marshall calculated his next move with a predatory focus. Every smile they gave me felt like a blade against my skin, but I remained motionless and focused on the evidence I still needed to gather to destroy their web of lies forever. I was no longer just a victim of their scheme. I had become the silent observer who was about to dismantle their lives with the same cold precision they had used against me. Throughout this past week, I have consistently felt my mind drifting into a heavy, suffocating fog immediately after drinking the morning coffee that Marshall prepares with such suspicious care. The lethargy would hit me within 20 minutes of the first sip, making it nearly impossible to focus on my financial spreadsheets or even maintain a simple conversation without stumbling over my words. I decided to take drastic action by secretly installing a tiny motion-activated camera disguised as a common USB charger in a corner of the kitchen where the light would capture everything clearly. When I reviewed the first night of footage on my laptop under the covers of my bed, my heart practically stopped as I watched my father carefully crush a small white tablet into a fine powder. Marshall stirred the substance into my personal mug with a cold, calculated precision that completely shattered any remaining hope I had about his paternal love. He stood there for a moment with a terrifyingly blank expression while waiting for the powder to dissolve completely before placing the mug exactly where I usually sit. The primary motive for this systematic drugging became chillingly clear when Marshall started placing legal documents regarding my late mother's trust fund on the table every afternoon. He knew that I was the only barrier standing between him and a fortune that he had no legal right to touch for his gambling debts. Whenever the sedation began to take hold of my nervous system, Marshall would lean in close while speaking in a low, hypnotic tone about how much easier life would be if I just shared the management burden with him. Beckett played his part perfectly as the concerned younger brother, constantly hovering around me and pretending to be worried about my deteriorating mental health. He would gently nudge the gold fountain pen toward my hand, while whispering that signing the papers was the best way to prove I still trusted the family during this difficult time. "You are just so tired lately, Tessa, so let us handle the heavy lifting for you while you focus on getting some much-needed rest," Beckett would say, with a deceptive smile. I realized that I had to fight back with the same level of deception they were using against me, so I began secretly swapping my drugged coffee for a fresh cup I kept hidden in the pantry. I practiced a rehearsed performance of confusion and physical instability, allowing my eyelids to droop and my speech to slur whenever Marshall entered the room to check on my progress. I would gaze vacantly at the ceiling or wander aimlessly through the hallway, making them believe that their plan to erode my cognitive function was succeeding beyond their wildest expectations. While I was pretending to be in a trance-like state, I kept a high-quality digital recorder running in my pocket to capture every whispered conversation they had when they thought I was unconscious. The sheer coldness in their voices as they discussed my future, as a mere obstacle to be removed, was far more effective at keeping me awake than any amount of caffeine ever could. The most horrifying revelation came on Thursday night, when the recorder captured Marshall and Beckett talking in the study about their final endgame for my living arrangements. I listened to the playback with trembling hands as my father detailed his plan to use my drugged state as evidence of early-onset dementia to have me committed to a long-term care facility. Marshall explained that once I was institutionalized, his power of attorney status would become permanent, allowing him to liquidate the trust fund and pay off his mounting casino markers without my interference. "Just keep giving her the doses until she signs that final page, then we can move her to that place out in the suburbs by the end of the month," Marshall whispered with a chilling lack of emotion. Beckett didn't even hesitate before asking if they could use the remaining money to buy the high-performance sports car he had been eyeing since the house sale. My father's response confirmed that he viewed my very existence as nothing more than a financial transaction that was nearing its expiration date. "Don't worry about the car, son, because once she's tucked away in that facility, we will have enough money to buy anything we want for the next 10 years. Marshall replied with a low chuckle. I sat on the floor of my bedroom in the darkness, feeling a cold, sharp rage crystallizing within me that replaced every ounce of fear I had previously felt. They were no longer just thieves who had stolen my savings. They were predators who were actively planning to steal my freedom and my very identity. I knew that I had enough evidence to destroy them both, but I needed to wait for the perfect moment when they were at their most arrogant to deliver the final blow. Every morning after that, I would sit at the table and drink my clean coffee while looking Marshall in the eye, knowing that his terrifying reign as the mastermind of this family was about to come to a violent end. At 7 o'clock that morning, the air in our Columbus kitchen became suffocatingly thick as Marshall placed the final authorization papers for my mother's trust fund onto the table. I sat there in silence, intentionally keeping my movements slow and deliberate to maintain the facade of a woman who was still struggling with the lingering effects of heavy sedation. Marshall exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Beckett, while sliding a gold fountain pen toward me with a hand that trembled slightly from suppressed excitement. My brother leaned against the kitchen counter with an expectant smirk, clearly anticipating the moment when my signature would finally grant them access to the fortune they had been hunting for months. I reached out and slowly wrapped my fingers around the pen, watching how their eyes widened with a predatory greed that made my skin crawl with absolute disgust. As I hovered the nib just millimeters above the signature line, the atmosphere in the room felt like a coiled spring ready to snap under the weight of their deception. Just as Marshall leaned forward to witness the completion of his masterpiece, I abruptly set the pen down and reached into my pocket to pull out my smartphone. I didn't say a single word as I pressed the play button on the recording app, allowing the high-definition audio of their midnight conversation to fill the quiet room. The sound of Marshall's chillingly calm voice detailing his plan to commit me to a psychiatric facility echoed off the walls with a clarity that froze the smiles on their faces. Beckett's face turned an ashen shade of gray as he heard his own voice asking for a sports car, while his sister was being systematically drugged into submission. I watched the realization dawn on Marshall that the daughter he thought he had broken had actually been recording every single word of his sinister betrayal. The absolute terror in his eyes was the first honest emotion I had seen from him in years, especially when the recording reached the part where he admitted to poisoning my daily coffee. The violent slap came so suddenly that I didn't have time to flinch, but the physical pain on my cheek was nothing compared to the immense satisfaction of seeing Marshall's control shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. He stood over me with a face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, his chest heaving as he realized that his sophisticated plan had been dismantled by the very person he viewed as a mere financial asset. I didn't cry or scream, because I simply looked him directly in the eye and spoke with a cold, unwavering clarity that made him stumble backward. I have known about everything from long before you even dared to raise your hand against me, Marshall, I said, while pushing a thick folder of evidence across the table toward him. I had included every forged admission letter, every record of his secret offshore transfers, and a detailed list of his mounting debts at illegal gambling dens throughout the state. Marshall's aggression was instantly replaced by a desperate, frantic energy as he began tearing through the documents and realizing the sheer magnitude of the legal trap I had set for him. Beckett began to hyperventilate while staring at the gambling markers that bore his own name, realizing for the first time that Marshall had intentionally used him as a legal shield for his crimes. My brother turned toward our father with a look of pure betrayal, finally understanding that he was just as much of a tool in this mastermind game as I was supposed to be. Marshall tried to grab my arm while screaming that I couldn't do this to my own blood, but I simply stood up and walked toward the front door with my phone already dialed to the local precinct. "You cannot do this to your own biological father, Tessa. It is a betrayal of everything this family stands for," Marshall shouted with a voice that was cracking under the weight of his own panic. I paused at the threshold while looking back at the two men who had spent 6 months trying to erase my existence for the sake of a casino debt. I informed them that my lawyer Douglas had already filed a preliminary injunction to freeze all family assets, and that this entire property was now under a strict legal lien. I watched the color continue to drain from Marshall's face as he realized that he had no money, no legal standing, and absolutely no way to escape the consequences of his actions. I calmly explained that the Columbus police were already less than 2 minutes away, and that I had provided them with a digital copy of every camera recording from the kitchen. The mastermind who had once felt so untouchable was now reduced to a trembling old man clutching a pile of useless forgeries in a house that no longer belonged to him. I felt a profound sense of peace as I heard the first distant wail of the police sirens, knowing that the era of my victimization was officially over and that their nightmare was only just beginning. The piercing wail of police sirens tore through the quiet suburban silence of the neighborhood as several patrol cars screeched to a halt right in front of my driveway. I stood by the large bay window and watched with a grim sense of finality as uniformed officers from the Columbus Police Department hurried toward our front porch. Inside the living room, Marshall and Beckett were frozen in a state of sheer panic, their faces pale as the reality of my earlier warning finally began to sink in. When the officers entered the house, Beckett immediately collapsed into a nearby armchair while pointing a trembling finger toward our father in a desperate attempt to save himself. He began shouting that he was completely innocent and that Marshall had forced him to participate in every stage of the financial deception under threat of being disowned. It was all his idea. I didn't know anything about the medicine or the bank transfers. He made me do it. Beckett screamed while the officers moved forward to secure his hands in heavy metal cuffs. My brother's frantic betrayal didn't seem to surprise Marshall, who simply stood there with a hollow expression while the police began a systematic search of the premises. I directed the lead investigator toward the kitchen pantry, where I knew Marshall had hidden the remaining supply of crushed sedatives and the forged legal documents. The officers carefully collected the small plastic containers and the thick stack of inheritance papers that bore my mother's forged signature as evidence for the upcoming criminal trial. Douglas, who had arrived just minutes after the police, stood beside me while ensuring that every piece of physical evidence was documented correctly by the crime scene technicians. Beckett continued his desperate pleading, claiming that he was just a victim of Marshall's manipulation, but his cries only served to highlight his own spineless character. I watched with a cold detachment as the two men who had shared my home for years were treated like common criminals in the very rooms where they had planned my downfall. Douglas stepped forward to interrupt Beckett's rambling excuses with a sharp professional tone that silenced the room almost instantly. "Save your breath, Beckett, because your name is written across every single illegal casino marker and luxury purchase we discovered in the offshore records," my lawyer stated while holding up a tablet displaying the undeniable digital evidence. The realization that his own signature was his downfall made Beckett's jaw drop, effectively ending his pathetic attempt to play the role of an unwitting accomplice. Marshall finally spoke, his voice sounding like dry parchment as he tried to demand that I call off the police and handle this matter privately within the family. I ignored his request entirely while stepping toward the officers to sign the formal witness statements regarding the physical assault and the prolonged financial fraud. I felt no hesitation or regret as I pressed the pen to the paper, knowing that every stroke of the ink was a step toward reclaiming the life they had nearly destroyed. The officers eventually led the two men out through the front door, where a crowd of neighbors had already gathered on the sidewalk to witness the shocking scene. People I had known for years stood in hushed groups, their faces filled with disbelief, as they saw the pillar of the community, Marshall, being led away in handcuffs. The facade of the protective father and the ambitious student was being torn away in the most public and humiliating manner possible for everyone in Columbus to see. Marshall tried to hide his face from the gazes of our neighbors, but there was nowhere to run from the shame he had brought upon himself through his own greed. Beckett was still sobbing as he was pushed into the back of a patrol car, his youthful arrogance completely replaced by the realization that he was facing actual prison time. I stood on the porch with Douglas, feeling the cool evening air on my face as the weight of their oppressive presence finally lifted from my shoulders. Before the last police car pulled away, Douglas handed me the emergency eviction order that he had successfully petitioned from the local court earlier that afternoon. This legal document meant that Marshall and Beckett were officially forbidden from returning to this property, and any attempt to contact me would result in immediate rearrest. I watched the red and blue lights fade into the distance, knowing that the locks would be changed within the hour, and that I was finally the sole master of my own home. The house felt strangely quiet and spacious now that the predators had been removed from the environment where they had once thrived on my misery. I turned back toward the living room and began the process of cleaning up the remnants of the morning confrontation, feeling a profound sense of strength that I hadn't possessed in months. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, I could finally breathe without feeling the weight of their deception pressing down on my chest. Inside the cold courtroom of Franklin County, I sat on the wooden bench reserved for the plaintiff, looking directly at Marshall, who was slumped in his seat wearing a drab orange inmate uniform. The man who had once dominated our household with his booming voice and calculated aggression now looked like a withered shadow of the mastermind he claimed to be. My lawyer Douglas stood before the judge while presenting a mountain of evidence that detailed every month of drugging, financial forgery, and psychological abuse. The prosecution didn't have to work hard because the digital recordings and the testimony from the bank officials were absolutely irrefutable. I watched Marshall's hands tremble as the judge began reading the list of charges, including felony elder abuse for his attempt to steal my late mother's Deson and grand larceny for the house proceeds. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of justice finally catching up to a man who thought he was untouchable behind his mask of paternal authority. The judge eventually handed down a sentence of 5 years in state prison for Marshall, citing the extreme premeditation and the cruelty of poisoning his own daughter. Beckett received a suspended sentence and was ordered to perform 300 hours of community service, but the real punishment was the permanent stain on his criminal record. He was officially expelled from any future academic prospects and found himself blacklisted from every reputable institution in the state of Ohio. My brother sat at the defense table with tears streaming down his face, realizing that the golden future Marshall had promised him had dissolved into a lifetime of shame. Even in that moment of absolute defeat, they both had the audacity to look toward me with pleading eyes, hoping for some flicker of the family loyalty they had so violently exploited. I remained perfectly still with a neutral expression, refusing to offer them even a single ounce of the pity they were so desperately hunting for. Throughout the entire 2-month legal process leading up to this day, I had firmly refused to pay a single dollar for their bail or their private legal representation. Marshall had sent dozens of letters from jail begging for mercy and reminding me of our sacred blood bond, but I had instructed Douglas to return every one of them unopened. Beckett had tried to call me multiple times while crying about how he was just a confused kid who followed our father's orders, yet I knew he was just as guilty of greed as Marshall. The people who once viewed Marshall as a pillar of the Columbus community were now watching his total public disgrace as the news of his gambling debts and fraud hit the local headlines. The mastermind plan he had spent years constructing had not only failed, but had resulted in the total forfeiture of his own remaining assets to compensate me for my losses. The court ordered a full seizure of his retirement accounts and the few properties he still held to repay the $500,000 he had diverted from my pocket. As the bailiffs moved forward to lead Marshall away to begin his 5-year sentence, he stopped for a brief moment and turned his head to glare at me with a look of pure hatred. The mask of the loving father had vanished completely, replaced by the bitter resentment of a predator who had finally been outplayed by his intended prey. He leaned as close as the guards would allow and spat out a final curse that echoed through the nearly empty courtroom. "You are nothing but a heartless monster without a soul. Tessa, to do this to the man who gave you life," Marshall hissed while his face turned a deep shade of crimson. I stood up slowly and straightened my blazer, meeting his gaze with a level of strength that I had never felt when he was in control of our lives. My voice was calm and steady as I replied, "No, I am simply the person who finally learned how to love herself more than she loved the blood-sucking parasites who tried to destroy her." Beckett tried to reach out to grab my hand as I walked toward the exit, but I stepped aside without even looking at him, allowing the court security to maintain the necessary distance. My brother realized in that final second that there would be no reconciliation and no second chances regardless of how much he pleaded. The consequences of their actions were real, practical, and devastatingly permanent, leaving them with nothing but the wreckage of their own failed ambitions. Marshall had lost his pension, his freedom, and the daughter who had once been his greatest source of financial security. I walked out of the Franklin County Courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, feeling the heavy chains of family obligation finally snapping away from my spirit. The legal battle was over and the predators were behind bars or under state supervision, where they could no longer reach me. I got into my car and drove away, without glancing back at the building, knowing that I had successfully dismantled the mastermind's trap and reclaimed my own destiny. 1 year after that shocking legal battle concluded, I stand on the balcony of my new apartment in Chicago, where nobody knows the dark history of the toxic family I left behind in Ohio. The cool breeze from Lake Michigan feels like a final cleansing of the heavy drugged swang moo that once dominated my every waking hour in Columbus. My name is Tessa, and I have finally managed to rebuild a life that belongs entirely to me, away from the predatory reach of those who once claimed to love me. I have found immense success in my new role as a senior risk manager at a global financial firm, proving that my skills were never the problem. With the money I successfully recovered through the court seizure of Marshall's assets, I established a nonprofit foundation dedicated to protecting women from financial abuse and domestic manipulation. Helping others recognize the early warning signs of family exploitation has given my past suffering a profound sense of purpose that I never thought possible. Marshall and Beckett have disappeared completely from my daily existence, as I have maintained a strict policy of never responding to any form of communication from either of them. My father is currently serving his 2nd year in state prison, and while Douglas informs me that he still attempts to send letters, I have instructed my legal team to destroy them before they ever reach my desk. Beckett has been forced to take a series of low-paying service jobs to pay off his remaining fines, yet I feel no desire to check on his progress or offer any financial assistance. The absolute freedom I enjoy now is a direct result of the cold, hard decision I made to cut the ties that were slowly strangling my spirit and my bank account. Every morning, I wake up with a clear mind and a steady hand, grateful that I no longer have to worry about what might be hidden in my coffee or my kitchen. The silence of my new life is not a sign of loneliness, but rather a testament to the peace that comes when you stop allowing parasites to thrive on your hard work. I no longer feel the heavy weight of older sister responsibility that Marshall used as a weapon to guilt-trip me into selling my future for a lie. Looking out over the Chicago skyline, I realized that the most difficult part of the journey wasn't the legal fight, but the moment I had to accept that my father was a predator. I have surrounded myself with a new community of honest friends who respect my boundaries and value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. The trust fund my mother left me is now securely managed by an independent board, ensuring that it will eventually go to the causes she truly cared about instead of a casino floor. I have learned that some bridges are meant to be burned to the ground so that the people who tried to destroy you can never cross back into your life. The mastermind who thought he could erase my identity for the sake of a gambling debt ended up losing everything he ever tried to steal from me. My victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the moment I chose to stop being a victim and started being the author of my own story. I am safe. I am successful. And for the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I am truly and completely free from the ghosts of my past. This production was created by our channel to serve as an educational narrative regarding the vital importance of personal boundaries and rational crisis management. Our goal is to demonstrate how legal action and emotional detachment are sometimes the only effective tools against domestic exploitation and financial abuse in the modern world. Jocelyn's decision to pursue absolute detachment was the only logical response to the systematic poisoning and fraud she experienced from her own kin. By choosing to prioritize her safety over traditional family loyalty, she forced the villains to face the inevitable legal consequences of their calculated betrayals. The events of this story provide several sharp and definitive lessons regarding self-preservation and the true nature of familial bonds in difficult circumstances. Sacrificing your future for family members is only a noble act when the recipients are worthy of that trust. Otherwise, it is simply a form of personal suicide. Manipulators will always use the sacred language of family as a weapon to bypass your logic, which is why you must use the law as your primary shield. Forgiveness is not a mandatory requirement for healing, and in cases of extreme betrayal, cutting ties completely is often the only path toward true salvation and self-respect. We would like to extend our deepest gratitude to everyone who stayed with us until the very final moments of this intense journey. Your time and attention are truly appreciated as we share these stories of resilience. If you found yourself in Tessa's position, would you eventually choose to forgive your father, or would you cut him off completely as she did?